Welcome to the Monotone Museum. Tonight's exhibit is about Sitting Bull. If you enjoy calm, carefully told history, please like and subscribe to help preserve these stories. Now, settle in, and let's begin. We are going to follow one of the most extraordinary human beings the 19th century produced. A man who was simultaneously a warrior, a holy man, a poet, a diplomat, a prophet, and a symbol of something the modern world has never quite stopped needing. A man whose visions came true, whose prayers were answered in ways that astonished even those who believed most deeply in the power of prayer, and whose death at the hands of his own people, manipulated by the government he had fought his entire life, was as dark and unnecessary as anything in American history. His name in Lakota was Tatanka Iyotake. It translates roughly as the buffalo bull who sits down and will not be moved, or more poetically, the one who sets the world on its haunches. He was called Sitting Bull, and the name was given to him not at birth but earned, the way Lakota names were earned, through an act that revealed who he actually was. He was primarily a holy man. Remember that. Everything else in his story, the wars, the diplomacy, the Wild West show, the ghost dance, the assassination, everything flows from that central fact. He was a Wichasha Wakang, a sacred man, and the power that moved through him moved through the specific channel of the sacred. When you understand that, you understand him. Close your eyes. The grass is breathing. The stars are very bright. We are going in. He was born around 1831. The exact year is uncertain, as it was for most Lakota children of that era, since the Lakota kept their histories in memory and in pictographic winter counts rather than in the written birth records of the European tradition, somewhere along the Grand River in what is now South Dakota. He was Hunkpapa Lakota, the people of the outer edge of the camp circle, the band whose position in the traditional arrangement of the Lakota nation placed them on the perimeter, which is to say, in the position of greatest exposure and greatest responsibility for the defense of the whole. His father was a man called Returns Again, who was also known as Sitting Bull, the name that would pass to his son in a ceremony of extraordinary meaning. His mother was her holy door, a woman of great patience and spiritual sensitivity who recognized early that her son was not an ordinary child. His family was respected, his father a man of standing in the Hunkpapa band, and the boy grew up in the warmth of a family that loved him and a community that was intact and functioning and alive in the way that the Hunkpapa world was alive in the years before the great pressure of American expansion had fully made itself felt. His childhood name was Slow. This was not a nickname or a term of affection. It was an accurate observation about a specific quality the boy possessed. A deliberateness, a refusal to be hurried, a tendency to think before acting that made him seem, to people who did not understand it, simply unhurried. He watched. He thought. He moved through the world at his own pace, which was measured and complete, and he arrived at his decisions after a process of consideration that other, quicker people sometimes found maddening. The Lakota, who had a sophisticated understanding of character and its relationship to destiny, read this quality correctly from the beginning. Slow was not slow in the sense of dull or incapable. He was slow in the sense of deep, the way deep water moves more slowly than shallow water, the way the largest animals tend to move with a deliberateness that smaller animals lack, the way the most powerful forces in nature do their work without hurry. He was also, from early childhood, visionary. He had dreams that came true. He saw things, not in the dramatic, theatrical way of people who perform spiritual experience for an audience, but in the quiet, private, entirely matter-of-fact way of someone for whom the boundary between the visible and invisible worlds was simply more permeable than it was for most people. He did not make a production of this. He simply noted what he saw and waited and watched what happened. He was good with horses from before the age at which most boys began riding. The intuitive communion with horses that the best Lakota riders had, the ability to communicate with an animal through weight and breath, and the subtle language of the body that is below the level of conscious instruction. He was good with a bow, developing accuracy and power that improved steadily through his boyhood years with the patience that characterized everything he did. And he was, by the accounts of those who knew him as a child, unusually kind, not soft. The Lakota world did not reward softness, and Slow was not soft, but genuinely, thoughtfully kind in the way that the wisest people are kind, from an understanding of what others feel that was deeper than ordinary empathy. He took care of younger children. He shared food without being asked. He noticed when people were struggling and found quiet ways to help that did not embarrass the person being helped. These qualities, the deliberateness, the vision, the physical capability, the kindness, would remain constant throughout his entire life. Everything that happened to him, everything he did and chose and refused and endured, is continuous with the boy called Slow who grew up along the Grand River in the 1830s, watching and thinking and waiting for the moment that would reveal his name. That moment came when he was 14 years old, in a raid against the Crow Nation. Raiding, the taking of horses from enemy bands, was the central activity of Lakota warrior culture, the practice through which young men proved themselves and through which the community maintained and increased its wealth in the form of horse herds. A boy's first raid was a threshold event, the moment that marked his transition from childhood to the beginning of his warrior career. Slow had been preparing for it with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. He rode into the Crow camp with the war party and he counted coup. He touched an enemy warrior with his coup stick, which required riding directly at an armed man and touching him before the man could defend himself, an act of such pure nerve that it was considered the highest expression of Lakota valor. He did this at 14 on his first raid, without hesitation, in the manner of a man who had been thinking about this moment for years and had decided exactly how it would go. When the war party returned, his father held a ceremony. He gave his son his own name. The boy called Slow became Sitting Bull, Tathanka Iotake, and his father took the name Jumping Bull in honor of the occasion. The name was not merely transferred, it was given with the understanding that the son had earned the right to carry it, that the quality the name represented, the immovable, the one who sits and will not be moved, the one who sets the world on its haunches, was present in the young man who had just ridden into the Crow camp with a courage that belied his 14 years. He was Sitting Bull. He would be Sitting Bull for the next 59 years, until the morning of December 15th, 1890, when the sun came up on the Grand River and he walked out of his cabin for the last time. To understand Sitting Bull, you have to understand what a Wichasha Wakang was in Lakota society, what the role meant, what it required, how it was recognized and cultivated and practiced. The Lakota universe was not divided into the natural and the supernatural the way European Christianity divided it. There was no clean line between the world you could see and the world you could not. Everything was permeated by Wakang, a word that is usually translated as sacred or mysterious, but which is better understood as the quality of aliveness in things, the animating power that moves through the world and connects everything to everything else. The sky was Wakang, the buffalo were Wakang, the thunder was Wakang, human beings were Wakang, and some human beings were more fully open to this quality than others, more permeable to it, better able to receive and transmit its communications. These people were the Wichasha Wakang. They were not born into the role the way European priests were ordained. They were recognized as having the capacity, and then they were trained, and the training was as rigorous as any medical or military training, requiring years of instruction, fasting, ceremony, and the development of spiritual sensitivity to a degree that most people never approached. Sitting Bull's spiritual development began in boyhood and continued his entire life. He undertook the vision quest, the rite of solitary fasting and prayer in which a young person went out alone to a high place or a remote location and remained there without food or water until a vision came. His visions were vivid, specific, and, as events would demonstrate, accurate. He saw things that had not yet happened and that subsequently happened exactly as he had seen them. He also composed songs. This is one of the least known and most remarkable facts about Sitting Bull. He was a poet and a composer, creator of more than 40 documented songs that have been preserved by Lakota historians and ethnographers. These songs were not casual expressions. They were sacred compositions, vehicles for spiritual communication, made with the care and precision that the Lakota brought to all sacred practice. Some of them are warrior songs, expressing the courage and the grief of the warrior's life. Some are prayer songs, addressed directly to the Wakantanka, the great mysterious power that underlies everything. Some are what can only be called lyric poems, expressions of his observation of the world, its beauty and its sadness in the compressed, imagistic form that the Lakota song tradition favored. One of his most famous songs, composed late in his life, goes in translation something like this: "A warrior I have been. Now it is all over. A hard time I have." He composed it as a statement of fact, not of self-pity, the same clarity and absence of drama with which he approached everything. He had been a warrior. That time was over. The hardness of what came after was real, and he acknowledged it, without flinching. His spiritual practice was also deeply connected to the natural world in specific, practical ways. He was a skilled observer of animals and believed that animals communicated with human beings if those human beings were paying sufficient attention. He had a particular relationship with birds, meadowlarks especially, and multiple accounts describe him stopping in the middle of other activities to listen to birdsong with the focused attention of a man receiving a message. On at least one documented occasion, he told others what a bird had said to him, and the content of what he said the bird had communicated turned out to be accurate. This sounds, to a modern secular ear, like folklore or fantasy. But consider the alternative explanation. A man of extraordinary observational sensitivity, trained from boyhood to attend to the natural world with total focus, noticing things in the behavior of birds and weather and animals and the quality of light that other people did not notice, and interpreting what he noticed through a spiritual framework that gave it meaning. The framework and the observation were inseparable for Sitting Bull, as they were for his entire culture. The bird spoke. He listened. What he heard was real. His warrior career developed alongside his spiritual development, the two intertwined, in the way that the Lakota understanding of the sacred warrior required. He fought in numerous engagements through the 1850s and 1860s, against the Crow, the Assiniboine, the Flathead, and increasingly against the United States Army as American military pressure on the northern plains intensified. He was wounded multiple times and recovered from each wound. He counted coup many times and earned the eagle feathers that represented his accumulating war honors. But he was never primarily a war chief in the way that Crazy Horse was a war chief. Never the tactical genius of the battlefield, the man whose instinct for mounted combat was unmatched. He was the spiritual foundation beneath the warriors, the man who prayed and fasted and received visions that told the community what was coming and what to do about it. The man whose presence before a battle changed the quality of the air, made the warriors feel that something larger than their individual courage was with them. He was also, increasingly, the political voice of the Hunkpapa, and eventually of the broader coalition of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho bands that would resist American expansion in the 1870s. His speeches, recorded by interpreters and later by people who spoke Lakota themselves, are among the most eloquent statements of indigenous political philosophy produced in the 19th century. He understood what was happening, the full systemic nature of the threat, with a clarity that many of his contemporaries on both sides of the conflict did not match, and he articulated that understanding with the precision and the imagery of a man who had spent a lifetime developing his capacity for expression. The 1860s brought the full weight of American military power to bear on the northern plains in ways that made the conflicts of previous decades look like skirmishes. The Civil War had ended in 1865, releasing hundreds of thousands of veteran soldiers and an enormous military-industrial apparatus that needed a new mission. The Transcontinental Railroad was being built, the Union Pacific pushing west from Omaha, the Central Pacific pushing east from Sacramento, and the railroad required the pacification of the territories it crossed, which meant the pacification of the people who lived in those territories. The Great Sioux War of 1876 is the most famous chapter of this conflict, but the resistance that culminated at Little Bighorn had been building for a decade, and Sitting Bull was at the center of it from the beginning. He had watched what happened when Lakota bands made accommodations with the American government. The steady erosion of territory, the dependence on government rations that replaced the buffalo hunting that had sustained the people for generations, the loss of political autonomy that came with accepting the reservation system. He had watched Red Cloud negotiate the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, which promised the Lakota permanent ownership of the Black Hills and the Powder River country, and he had watched the Americans violate that treaty within a decade when gold was found in the Black Hills. He never signed a treaty, not once. He attended councils where treaties were discussed, and he participated in the debates with the full force of his political intelligence. But he never put his mark on a document that ceded Lakota land or sovereignty to the United States government, because he believed, correctly, as events consistently demonstrated, that the documents meant less than the power behind them, and that the power behind them was in the process of taking everything, regardless of what the documents said. He was the leader of what historians call the non-treaty bands, the Lakota and allied people who refused to come to the agencies, who continued to live in the traditional way in the Powder River country and the Yellowstone drainage, following the buffalo, conducting their ceremonies, raising their children in the world as it had been. By the early 1870s, this coalition had coalesced around Sitting Bull's leadership in a way that made him the most significant political and spiritual authority among the free bands of the Northern Plains. He was not a dictator. The Lakota political system did not work that way. He could not order people to do things. What he could do was what the greatest leaders in any culture do. He could articulate a vision so clearly and embody it so completely that people chose to follow it. He had the authority of someone who had never asked for anything for himself, who had consistently put the welfare of the people before his own comfort and safety, who had demonstrated in dozens of specific situations that his judgment could be trusted. This kind of authority, earned rather than inherited, moral rather than coercive, is the hardest kind to acquire and the most durable once acquired. The United States government tried several times in the early 1870s to negotiate with him. He received commissioners and listened to what they had to say and responded with a directness that the commissioners found disconcerting. When a government representative told him that the United States was the greatest nation in the world, he replied that he knew it was a powerful nation, and he knew that power was being used to take what the Lakota had, and he did not wish to quarrel with the facts of the situation. When he was told that resistance was futile, that the Americans were too many and too well armed for the Lakota to prevail in any long-term conflict, he acknowledged this too. He was not a man who lied to himself about the dimensions of the problem he faced. He simply believed that some things were worth doing even when the outcome was not certain, because the alternative, not doing them, was a certainty of a different and worse kind. In the winter of 1875 to 1876, the government issued its high ultimatum. All non-treaty Lakota must report to their agencies by January 31, 1876, or be considered hostile. It was the same ultimatum that Crazy Horse received in the same impossible winter with the same implicit threat. Sitting Bull did not reply. The deadline passed. The army began moving. What the army did not know, because the army's intelligence on the free bands was poor and because the scale of what was happening was not yet visible, was that the non-treaty bands were gathering. Word had spread through the winter camps that the government intended to force the Lakota onto the reservations, that the Black Hills were going to be taken regardless of the treaty, that this was the last stand of the old life. People came. More than had been expected, more than the army was prepared for. By the time the great encampment gathered on the greasy grass, the Little Bighorn River, in the summer of 1876, it was the largest gathering of Plains Indian people in recorded history. Between 10 and 15,000 people with perhaps 2,000 warriors, and at the spiritual center of it all was Sitting Bull. 6 weeks before the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Sitting Bull underwent a sun dance. The sun dance was the most sacred ceremony of the Lakota people, the annual ritual of sacrifice and renewal in which dancers pledged their bodies and their suffering to the Hunkpapa in exchange for the continuation of the world's goodness. The dancers fasted. They did not sleep. They danced around the sacred pole for hours and days. their bodies pierced through the skin of the chest or back with wooden skewers attached by leather thongs to the pole, dancing and pulling against the thongs until the skin tore and they were released. This is not masochism, and it is not theatre. It is the offering of the one thing a person owns completely and unconditionally, the body, the flesh, the physical self, to something larger than the self. The pain is real and it is offered deliberately, not endured accidentally. The transformation that comes from it is real in the way that any genuine encounter with the limits of the self produces a genuine transformation. In June 1876, on the Rosebud River in what is now southern Montana, Sitting Bull danced. He danced for 36 hours. He had the flesh of his arms cut 100 times, 50 on each arm, tiny pieces of skin removed with an awl, each cut a small sacrifice, the blood running down his arms and offering onto the earth. 100 pieces of flesh offered to the Wakang Thanka in payment for what he was about to ask. He asked for a vision of what was coming. He asked whether his people would survive what was coming. He asked for the truth, whatever it was, because he needed to know. The vision came as he danced in the state of consciousness that extreme physical deprivation and sustained spiritual focus produce. A state that is neither sleep nor waking, but something that has access to both. He saw soldiers, many soldiers, more than he could count, falling from the sky into the Lakota camp. They were falling headfirst, their feet in the air, their hats falling off. They were falling like grasshoppers fall when you disturb a field, sudden, numerous, disorganized, powerless against the force dropping them. And a voice said to him, "I give these to you, but do not take their belongings." He came out of the vision, and he told the people what he had seen. He told them that soldiers were coming and that soldiers would fall. He told them that the victory was given to them, but that they must not take the soldiers' possessions because the Wakang Thanka required this restraint as the condition of the gift. He told them what was coming with the calm certainty of a man describing something he had seen with his own eyes, because he had. 6 weeks later, on June 25, 1876, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led 5 companies of the 7th Cavalry down the bluffs above the Little Bighorn River and into the largest concentration of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors ever assembled. Every one of Custer's approximately 210 men was killed. The soldiers fell like grasshoppers. The warning about the belongings was not fully heeded. Warriors took the soldiers' guns and ammunition and horses, as was the custom of plains warfare. Some Lakota oral traditions hold that this violation of the vision's condition was the beginning of what came after, that the failure to honor the full terms of the gift set in motion the losses that followed. Whether or not one accepts this interpretation, the vision itself stands as one of the most precisely accurate documented prophecies in American history. 6 weeks before the battle, in a state of ritual consciousness, Sitting Bull saw soldiers falling from the sky into the camp. 6 weeks later, they fell. The victory at Little Bighorn did not save the Lakota world. This was something Sitting Bull understood even as the battle was being won. He had seen the soldiers falling from the sky, but the sky had not been empty behind them. There were always more soldiers. The mathematics of the situation had not changed. The army came back with a ferocity that Little Bighorn had intensified, rather than diminished. General Nelson Miles, the same relentless officer who pursued Crazy Horse through the winter of 1876 to 1877, pushed north and east with his column, attacking camps in the dead of winter, burning food supplies, killing horses. The great coalition that had gathered at the Little Bighorn dispersed, as it always did after the summer gathering, into smaller winter bands, and those bands were hunted down one by one. Sitting Bull chose differently from Crazy Horse. Where Crazy Horse brought his people into the Red Cloud Agency in May of 1877, surrendering to a world that would kill him 4 months later, Sitting Bull chose exile. He led his band, perhaps 4,000 people at the peak, though the number fluctuated as circumstances changed, north across the Medicine Line into Canada, into what was then called the Northwest Territories and is now Saskatchewan. The Medicine Line, the 49th parallel, the border between the United States and Canada, was one of the most significant lines in the history of the Northern Plains, and its significance was almost entirely abstract. It was a surveyor's line, a political boundary created by treaty between two governments. The land on both sides of it was identical, the same shortgrass prairie, the same wind, the same sky. The buffalo did not observe it. The seasons did not observe it. But the American army observed it absolutely. Once Sitting Bull crossed into Canada, the United States Army could not follow him. He was in the jurisdiction of the Northwest Mounted Police, the newly formed Canadian force that had arrived on the prairies just 2 years earlier, and the Mounted Police operated under different rules and different political authority than the American military. The officer who met Sitting Bull at the border was Major James Morrow Walsh, a compact, self-confident Irishman who had been with the Mounted Police since its founding, and who had a reputation for dealing honestly and directly with the native people of the Canadian prairies. He rode out to meet the Hunkpapa band with a small escort, a handful of men meeting a war chief who had just overseen the destruction of Custer's command, and he introduced himself and explained the situation with admirable clarity. In Canada, Walsh told Sitting Bull, the law was the same for everyone. The Queen's law protected everyone equally, white and native alike. If Sitting Bull and his people obeyed the law, did not raid across the border into the United States, did not attack Canadian settlers, did not make war, they would be protected and could live in peace. If they broke the law, they would face the same consequences as anyone else. Sitting Bull listened carefully, as he always listened carefully. He asked questions. He tested the proposition, not argumentatively, but with the thoroughness of a man who had been lied to by governments before and needed to understand the specific terms of what was being offered. Walsh answered his questions directly, and the answers were consistent, and Sitting Bull decided to believe him. He and Walsh developed a genuine relationship, one of the more remarkable cross-cultural friendships of the era. They met regularly over the 4 years of Sitting Bull's Canadian exile, speaking through interpreters about the political situation, about the needs of the Lakota refugees, about the question that was always at the center of everything. Could Sitting Bull and his people stay in Canada permanently, or would they eventually have to return to the United States? Walsh liked Sitting Bull. This is documented in his private correspondence, as well as his official reports. He found the Hunkpapa leader intelligent, honest, and genuinely admirable, and he said so in terms that were unusual for a government. Official writing about a native leader in 1877. Sitting Bull, for his part, trusted Walsh more than he had trusted most white men he had encountered, which was not a short list. The Canadian years were hard in ways that the initial relief of sanctuary could not prevent. The buffalo were going. This was not a Canadian problem specifically. The great herds that had sustained the Plains people for thousands of years were being exterminated across the entire continent, in a process that was accelerating every year as the commercial hide hunters worked their way north and west. By the late 1870s, the herds that had once been everywhere were shrinking into the southern ranges that the Lakota could not safely reach, because those ranges were in American territory, and the army was waiting there. His people were hungry. The Canadian government, unwilling to commit to feeding American refugees indefinitely, declined to provide the kind of rations that American agency Indians received. The Lakota in Canada were not Canadian treaty Indians. They were guests, technically, in a jurisdiction that had not invited them and was not obligated to support them. The Northwest Mounted Police provided what help they could, but it was never enough, and the winters were long. He sent delegations to Washington to explore the terms under which he might return. The American government's position was consistent. Unconditional surrender, relocation to a reservation, the end of any pretense of political independence. He found these terms unacceptable. He continued to hold out. In October 1877, the government sent a commission to Canada to negotiate directly with him. The lead commissioner was General Alfred Terry, one of the commanders of the three-pronged campaign that had been intended to trap the Lakota in the summer of 1876, and had produced Little Bighorn instead. The meeting took place at Fort Walsh, with Walsh present and a large crowd of Lakota, mounted police, and press correspondents watching. Sitting Bull listened to the American offer. It was, as before, unconditional surrender and the reservation. He declined. He did so at length with the full force of his rhetorical gift, laying out the history of American treaty violations with the precision of a lawyer and the passion of a man who had watched his world be dismantled piece by piece. The correspondents who covered the meeting wrote about his speech with admiration that they seemed surprised to feel. Here was the enemy, the man whose warriors had killed Custer, and he was making the most coherent and morally serious speech any of them had heard in years. He turned to the women of his band who were present at the council. He asked them to speak because he wanted the commissioners to hear from the people whose lives and children were at stake. The women spoke. They described what American soldiers had done to their camps, their children, their property. The commissioners had no answer to what the women said. Sitting Bull refused the American terms. He shook hands with Walsh and walked out of the council. Terry returned to Washington empty-handed. In the summer of 1881, Sitting Bull led the last of his band, reduced by the years of hunger and hardship, to approximately 186 people, across the Medicine Line back into the United States and surrendered at Fort Buford in what is now western North Dakota. He was 50 years old or thereabouts. The surrender was not a moment of defeat in the way that the army wanted it to be. He had held out longer than anyone. He had kept a free Lakota band in existence for 5 years after Little Bighorn, in conditions that had defeated everyone else. He had done everything that could be done with the resources available to him, and when those resources were finally exhausted, when the buffalo were gone and the children were hungry and there was nothing left to sustain the life he had been defending, he came in on his own terms and in his own time. He surrendered his rifle to his young son, Crowfoot, who handed it to the army officer receiving the surrender. It was a gesture of considerable symbolic weight, the weapon passing through the next generation rather than directly from his own hands, as if to say, "I am giving up the fight, but I am not giving up the future." He was held at Fort Randall, in South Dakota for nearly 2 years, not as a prisoner of war in any formal sense, but effectively confined, watched, prevented from going to the Standing Rock Agency, where he had asked to be settled with his people. The army was not sure what to do with him. He was too famous to ignore, too politically significant to treat as an ordinary reservation Indian, too proud and too articulate to be easily managed. He eventually was allowed to go to the Standing Rock Agency on the Grand River, the same river he had been born on 50 years earlier. He lived in a log cabin on the western bank, farming the small plot assigned to him, raising horses, receiving visitors, continuing his spiritual practice with the same seriousness he had always brought to it. He was watched by the agency's Indian, Agent James McLaughlin, a man whose relationship with Sitting Bull became one of the most complicated and ultimately most dangerous dynamics of the reservation era. McLaughlin was not a cruel man, by the standards of his time and his job. He was efficient, paternalistic, genuinely committed to what he understood as the welfare of the Lakota people under his charge, and constitutionally unable to tolerate the presence on his reservation of a man whose authority exceeded his own in the eyes of the people he was supposed to be managing. Sitting Bull was, on the Standing Rock Agency, a constant implicit rebuke to everything McLaughlin represented, the living symbol of a sovereignty and a way of life that McLaughlin's entire professional purpose was dedicated to replacing with something else. The two men circled each other for years with the wary, mutual recognition of people who understand each other's position perfectly and find it completely incompatible. In 1885, Sitting Bull joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. This requires a moment of context because it is one of the stranger episodes of the 19th century, and it is easy to interpret it wrongly. William Frederick Cody, Buffalo Bill, was one of the great showmen of the American West, a man who had been a genuine frontier scout and buffalo hunter, and had then turned his frontier experience into one of the most successful entertainment enterprises of the era. His Wild West show toured the United States and Europe with a cast that included former Army Scouts, cowboy performers, sharpshooters, and Native American performers who reenacted scenes from what was being presented, even as it was happening, as the vanishing American West. The show had been trying to recruit Sitting Bull for years. His name was the most famous Native American name in the world, famous in Europe as well as America, where the penny press had made him a figure of almost mythological dimensions in the decades since Little Bighorn. His presence in the show would be, from a commercial standpoint, extraordinary. Buffalo Bill wanted him badly. Why did Sitting Bull agree? This is a question that historians have debated, and the answers they have proposed are various and probably all partially true. The money was real. He was paid $50 a week, plus a bonus for signing, plus the proceeds from the photographs and autographs he sold, which were considerable. He gave much of this money away, particularly to the children he saw on the streets of the cities the show visited, who were poor and hungry in the specific urban poverty that the industrial America of the 1880s generated. But money alone does not explain it. He had other motivations that he expressed clearly to those who asked. He wanted to see the white world, to understand the enemy, in the way that a great strategist always wants to understand what he is facing. He wanted to see with his own eyes the cities, the factories, the numbers of people, the scale of the civilization that was pressing against his own. He wanted to know what he was dealing with. He also, perhaps, understood that the show was a form of communication. Every night, in arenas across the country, Sitting Bull appeared before audiences of white Americans, the same Americans who had been told for years that he was a bloodthirsty savage, a monster, the man who had massacred Custer, and they saw, instead, a man of obvious dignity and intelligence and gravity, a man who carried himself with the authority of someone who had lived a serious life and knew it. The shows did not speak directly about these things, but the presence spoke. He toured for 4 months, from June to October of 1885. He traveled to cities he had never seen, New York, Washington, Montreal, cities whose scale must have been genuinely staggering to a man who had spent his life on the northern plains. He met President Grover Cleveland during the Washington stop, briefly, in the kind of encounter that neither man probably knew what to do with. He visited the poor neighborhoods of the cities he passed through and was disturbed by what he saw. Disturbed in the specific, morally serious way of a man who could not understand why a people with so much would permit some of its members to have so little. He and Buffalo Bill developed a genuine friendship, one of the more unlikely relationships of the era. Cody was a showman, a mythmaker, a man whose relationship with truth was instrumental rather than absolute. Sitting Bull was a holy man whose relationship with truth was the foundation of everything. They had almost nothing in common except a quality of authenticity that each recognized in the other. Cody gave him a horse, a gray circus horse trained to rear and bow on command. Sitting Bull loved this horse. He took it back to Standing Rock when the tour ended. He refused to tour again the following year. He had seen what he needed to see. He understood the scale of what the Lakota were facing more completely than he had before, and what he understood was not encouraging. In 1889, a Paiute holy man named Wovoka had a vision during a solar eclipse. The vision told him that if the native people of the continent performed a specific ceremony, a circle dance, conducted with prayer and specific songs, conducted in peace, the ancestors would return, the buffalo would come back, and the white people would be swept away by a great flood or wind, and the world as it had been would be restored. The ghost dance spread across the plains with extraordinary speed, carried by word of mouth, by delegations from one nation to another, by the desperate hope of people who had lost almost everything and were willing to believe that the lost things could be returned. It reached the Lakota in 1890, and it spread through the reservation communities like fire through dry grass, because the Lakota were exactly the people for whom such a vision was most urgently needed. Sitting Bull did not originate the ghost dance. He was skeptical of it in some ways. His own visionary tradition was precise and demanding, and he was not easily credulous about other people's visions. But he allowed the dance to be performed in his camp because his people needed it and because he would not deny his people something that gave them hope. And as the dance spread and the agency authorities grew more alarmed, his tolerance of it was used as evidence of his dangerousness. James McLaughlin, the Standing Rock agent, had been looking for an opportunity to diminish Sitting Bull's influence on the reservation for years. The ghost dance provided it. He wrote to Washington that Sitting Bull was the fomenter of the ghost dance trouble, that his presence was destabilizing the reservation, that he needed to be removed. Washington authorized his arrest. The decision to use Indian police rather than army soldiers to arrest Sitting Bull was a deliberate strategy. It was intended to make the arrest appear to be an internal Lakota matter rather than an American military action to reduce the risk of the kind of resistance that the presence of soldiers might provoke. The Indian police at Standing Rock were Lakota men who had made the practical decision to work within the reservation system, and they knew Sitting Bull, and some of them had personal grievances against him that went back years. In the early morning hours of December 15, 1890, 43 Indian police officers surrounded Sitting Bull's cabin on the Grand River. Their orders were to arrest him and transport him to the agency headquarters. He was 59 years old, or thereabouts. He had been awake through much of the night. There had been dancing in his camp, ghost dance ceremonies that had gone on through the dark hours. He had a sense, by some accounts, that something was coming. His horse, the grey circus horse that Buffalo Bill had given him, still alive and stabled nearby, had been acting strangely. The police came before dawn. Lieutenant Bull Head commanded them, with Sergeant Red Tomahawk and First Sergeant Shavehead as his senior officers. They knocked on the cabin door and entered. Sitting Bull was in his bed. They told him he was under arrest. He submitted, initially. He asked to be allowed to dress, and they permitted this. He asked to have his horse saddled, and they permitted this. He came outside with the police officers into the pre-dawn dark of December on the northern plains, and the crowd that had gathered, his family, his supporters, ghost dancers who had been at the camp through the night, saw what was happening and began to protest. Catch the Bear, one of his followers, fired his rifle at Bull Head. Bull Head was hit, and as he fell, he fired his pistol at Sitting Bull. Red Tomahawk, behind Sitting Bull, fired at the same moment. 2 bullets struck Sitting Bull, one in the chest, one in the head. He fell. The grey circus horse, hearing the gunfire, or responding to something else, something less explicable, began to perform its show tricks. It sat down. It raised one leg. It bowed its head. The horse that Buffalo Bill had trained to perform for crowds in arenas across America and Europe was performing its routine in the mud of the Grand River in the pre-dawn dark, surrounded by the bodies of the dead and dying, while its owner lay on the ground. The Lakota who were there, and who survived to tell about it, said that the horse was performing the death ceremony, that it understood what had happened and was honoring it in the only language it had. 6 Indian police officers were killed in the fight that followed Sitting Bull's death. 2 of his supporters were killed. His son, Crow Foot, the boy who had handed the rifle to the army officer at Fort Buford 9 years earlier, who was now 17 years old, was found hiding inside the cabin and was killed by the police. Thiardai, Grand River ran past the cabin on its way south, as it had run past the place where Sitting Bull was born 60 years before, as it had run through all the years of his life in between. It was running that morning too, cold and dark in December, indifferent to everything that had just happened on its bank, as rivers are always indifferent, as rivers always outlast everything. His body was taken to Fort Yates and buried in an unmarked grave in the post cemetery, a deliberate erasure, a final attempt to prevent the kind of pilgrimage and memorial that the army feared his grave might attract. The burial did not remain secret. People knew where he was. They came anyway. In 1953, Lakota descendants disinterred his remains and reburied them on a bluff overlooking the Missouri River near Mobridge, South Dakota, close to the land where he had been born. A granite monument marks the site. The Missouri runs below it, wide and brown and powerful, carrying the snowmelt of the Rockies and the northern plains to the sea, as it has done since the last ice age, and will do long after every monument has crumbled to dust. The ghost dance did not bring the ancestors back. The buffalo did not return. The white people were not swept away. The world as it had been was not restored. But Wovoka's vision had been true in ways that were not immediately visible. The dancing did not end with Sitting Bull's death. The Lakota continued to dance at Standing Rock and Pine Ridge in Cheyenne River in defiance of the government's prohibition, in assertion of a spiritual life that could not be arrested or shot or buried in an unmarked grave. 2 weeks after Sitting Bull's death came the massacre at Wounded Knee, which killed between 200 and 300 Lakota men, women, and children, and is generally considered the last major military action of the Indian Wars. But after Wounded Knee, the Lakota were still there. They are still there. Sitting Bull left behind more than most people leave. He left his songs. 40-some documented compositions that have been preserved by Lakota historians and that are still sung in certain ceremonial contexts on the Standing Rock and other reservations. He left his speeches, which were recorded by interpreters and journalists and which stand as some of the most eloquent political statements in American history. He left the memory of what he had done and what he had refused to do, which continues to live in the Lakota community as a mic kind of instruction about what is possible when a person is fully committed to something true. He left the Sundance vision. It remains one of the most precisely documented prophetic visions in the historical record. Not a vague prophecy that could be fitted to many outcomes, but a specific, visual, detailed account of what would happen, given to his community 6 weeks before it happened, in every detail accurate. Whatever explanation one offers for this, the fact itself is not in dispute. He saw it. It happened. The soldiers fell from the sky like grasshoppers, exactly as he had said they would. He left the example of his life under pressure, the quality of his response to a situation that was, by any objective analysis, hopeless. He did not pretend it was not hopeless, he was too honest for that. But he did not accept that hopelessness was a reason to stop being who he was, to give up the things that mattered, to trade the actual life for a diminished version of it that the government was offering as the price of survival. He held to himself and to his people and to the world as it should be, as long as holding was physically possible. And when it was no longer possible, he came in with his head up. The Standing Rock Sioux tribe, the Hunkpapa and Blackfeet, Lakota, still exists. The reservation where Sitting Bull spent his last years straddles the border between North and South Dakota along the Missouri River, in the country he knew. The Standing Rock water protectors who gathered at the Dakota Access Pipeline protests in 2016 were his people, carrying the same arguments about land and sovereignty and the right to exist as themselves that he had been making since the 1860s. The arguments are still being made because they have not yet been fully answered. He is buried on a bluff above the Missouri, near Mobridge, South Dakota. The river below him is the same river that ran past the cabin where he was born, past the camps of his boyhood, past the agency where he spent his last years. The river does not remember him, because rivers do not remember. But the Lakota remember. They have been remembering for 130 years, with the particular fidelity that comes from knowing that the thing being remembered is not finished, that the argument is still being made, that the man on the bluff above the river is not entirely past tense. Morning star appeared in the east this morning, as it appears every morning. Venus, bright and patient, the first light in the pre-dawn dark, promising what is coming. The stars are turning on their ancient paths above the northern plains, above the Missouri River, above the bluff and the granite monument and the country that was his. The Thanka Iotake, he who sets the world on its haunches. He was here. He was fully here, in the way that only people who have decided to be fully alive are fully here. He is in the grass, and the river, and the songs that are still sung, and the arguments that are still made, and the simple, durable fact that the Lakota are still the Lakota, still here, still themselves, still on their land. He held. The world moved. Around him and he held. That is enough. That is everything.